Well, we're seeing a beautiful picture there of the TNT Express, and we're coming to you live from the terrace area of the Hyatt Regency Hotel. And the reason we're outside, well, it's a big day in Trinidad and Tobago. Beautiful morning, actually. If you had a chance to really come outside and see, we really are a blessed nation. This morning, October 1st, the big day for Minister Larry Hawaii, the People's Partnership Government. Hawaii's test. Finance Minister faces challenge of balancing his first budget today. Browne says media fell for VAT removal, hook, line and sinker. Prime Minister reveals more budget goodies. Construction to boom again. Former Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Mariano Browne. Mr. Browne, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
The big announcement over the weekend, the People's Partnership held a pre-budget rally. Major announcement, the removal of VAT as they attempt to, one, battle high food prices, which will have a ripple effect on the inflation rate in Trinidad and Tobago. Positive?
Well, I don't know what she's going to remove VAT on. There are about 11 pages already of food items from which VAT has been removed, including all basic food items, and that's since 2008. So it's unclear to me what that means in real terms. So I have to wait to see what the announcement says, but I don't expect it to make any difference. Certainly not to inflation, or certainly not to food prices generally.
Do you think it's simply playing politics with the expectations of the people?
I think it's a huge miscalculation. I think somebody whispered that this is something that should be done and didn't tell her, unfortunately, before she spoke, that it had already been done, and much of it had already been done. So it's an error of judgment, an error of many things. So let's leave it to that.
Looking at the minister's big test today, now the Prime Minister reveals more budget goodies, construction to boom yet again. The previous administration received the wrath of the population and that of the independent analysts in the country at that time, saying that it was responsible for overheating. The local construction sector was saying that there was favoritism. A number of outcries were heard. Your thoughts on the article today in the Newsday newspaper, which said that national security, housing are some of the priorities of the 2012-2013 budget?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see exactly what that means. In terms of national security has been a priority for the last 5 years. In fact, there are three ministries that together take up the lion's share of any budget, and that is health, national security, and education. I don't think that's going to change. The fact that they're saying they're going to spend a lot more in terms of construction, that's a positive step. But the issue and the constraint is going to be at the expense of what? We've had two budgets under this government which have projected substantial deficits, supposedly, that would be stimulative. In both instances, we've seen very little deficit. In fact, this year, as at the third quarter fiscal overview, we were $1 billion in surplus, and considerably less. In other words, the deficits have not materialized. We've talked about spending more money, but we haven't done it. At this stage, the construction sector, which should be in substantial surplus, there's a lot of inactivity, so that the overheating that was seen previously, you ought not to see. The issue will be what projects, where, when, and how. But I don't think that those are the critical priorities. Those are important to have. I think the critical priority is how we deal with the energy sector. I think the energy sector is a substantial worry area as we speak. 65%, we account for 65 to 75% of the exports of methanol to North America. And North America is in a situation where it has discovered shale gas, in fact, cheap shale gas that has brought down prices. And many other people, like Trinidad and Tobago, have been targeting the North American market for expansion. What the cheap shale gas does is make it possible for North American producers, in fact, to produce in the U.S. instead of importing. And given the statements with regard to jobs and everything else that has been made in the run-up to the U.S. election, and in fact, right now, as we speak, in terms of planning, there's so far a planned number of methanol plants that will lead to overcapacity in the U.S., which creates some difficulty for our exports in terms of us finding alternative markets. We've been able to do that well in terms of liquefied natural gas. I'm not certain that it's going to be as easy with methanol. That's the first point, because the world is still in recession. With the best will in the world, the recovery hasn't taken place. The other point from that is that given the fact that there are many other people who are producing natural gas at this stage, and they're likely to come on stream in the next 2 to 3 years, that puts Trinidad in the middle of a precipice, because it means that ultimately it must affect gas prices elsewhere. And if you look at that, in fact, if you look at Gazprom, which is the largest supplier of natural gas to Europe, Gazprom in itself has been attacked by the European Commission and arguing that its pricing policy of attaching the price of natural gas to oil is anti-competitive and needs to be reviewed. And in fact, there's going to be a substantial test case. So Russia's going to find itself straight right now, as we speak, immediately before the doors of the European Court. So that means that the likelihood is that international prices of natural gas may well fall. And that creates a further issue for us. Now, the real issue means that we either export more or alternatively we find new sources of production. We've had declines in exports of 3% this year, 9% in the first half of this year, 3% last year, 3% the previous year. Those are worrisome indicators because our majority of our revenue comes from energy exports.
A number of conferences have been held, diversification, looking at growth. Growth poles have been identified. Clusters have also been identified as we attempt to diversify and gain revenue from other sectors.
They're not new ideas. The real issue with diversification has to do with the amount of money you're prepared to spend on diversification. And it's a combination of investment dollars on one hand, as well as the amount of effort that you put behind it. And certainly, I think governments have spoken more than they're spent. And the real thing is that what they've really concentrated on has remained the energy sector. So diversification for it to take place is going to be a 7 to 10-year process. In some instances, it's going to take a lot longer than that to put the necessary infrastructural capacity in position. So I don't see that as being a short-run objective.
How wise test? Finance Minister faces a challenge of balancing his first budget today. What are the things that you are hoping to hear today? Well, and if these things are not stated, would you consider it a failure?
Well, I think the real challenge is to deal with the issue of subsidies and transfers. Subsidies and transfers under the PNM would have accounted for approximately 40% of the budget. That was financeable at the time precisely because of the buoyancy of oil revenues. As we speak, subsidies as a percentage of the budget, subsidies and transfers as a percentage of the budget have risen to something in the region of about 52%. So that's a substantial increase at a time when our revenue is challenged. In those perspectives, I mean, one of the key issues would be whether he would follow the medium-term strategy which is outlined in paragraph 15 of the IMF report, which essentially is to freeze any expenditures or allow it to grow only insofar as the economy grows. And in some senses to actually reduce the expenditures. One of the critical issues in that regard would be the issue of what we call the petrol or gas subsidy, which because prices were high last year, it accounts for approximately $4 billion or roughly 9% of your budget. That certainly is an area which would have to be dealt with now.
Do you think that we're in, and I'm not just leveling criticism against the current administration, but previous administrations making the tough decisions to actually benefit our country? Let's take the politics out of it. Are we the kind of nation that we all agree, every single person that sits on this set says the gas subsidy we cannot afford to maintain it at the level that we do? All of the subsidies, all of the welfare programs, serious decisions need to be made for state sector companies. Can we really make it as a nation? Would we as a people allow the government to make these decisions?
Well, there will be substantial difficulties. One of the issues that this government faces is the issue of credibility, which has a credibility gap which has risen substantially over the course of the last couple of weeks. And to really take on that responsibility, you have to, in a sense, communicate with your public and to have discussions with. This government came into power on the basis that it was going to communicate in a way that the previous administration has not. And unfortunately has not lived up to that promise. So the credibility gap also gives it great difficulty in terms of taking any hard decisions. Now, I don't think that they can avoid the issue of taking hard decisions. They've already, for example, in a sense, been making incremental decisions at the margin by not doing. You have a choice of doing or not doing or reacting. And what I have seen out of this administration is not doing. Say that you're going to do all these wonderful things and actually not do them.
If you had to measure the success or the rate of implementation from the 2011-2012 budget to what is going to be presented today, how much do you think has been implemented? How many projects are still in the pipeline and how many have yet to get started?
Well, the answer is that no projects have really been implemented. And none of the critical ones with regard to improving the quality of life or administration in the country. And what we've had is expenditure plans at the cheap areas, which unfortunately lead to increased deficits. So on an implementation budget, I have to say they score very low. I think this is one of the difficulties that all administrations are going to face, that there's a change in the mood. So increasingly there needs to be a tie-in between what we say in the budget speech and what we do during the course of the year. Rather than just simply have these high-sounding statements which are not implemented during the course of the year. And I think we need to deal with that.
Mr. Browne, construction to boom again. We're looking at the removal of VAT for food prices. We're looking at construction to boost economic activity. Some will argue that it's about time that while these will make an impact on the level of employment, activity in the economy, that we should be looking to other solutions. That if we had to really transform Trinidad and Tobago to a knowledge-based society, are we really any closer to doing that if we continue to look at old remedies to find solutions?
Well, the answer to that is no. I think we have many examples in front of us, particularly in Europe as we speak, about countries, for example, that have essentially tried to spend their way out of a recession. So I don't think that, I mean, it's a good thing that we should be spending some money on construction. It's a good thing that we should be putting, if you want, idle assets to work. It's a good thing that we're putting a dent in certain areas. But that by itself is not sustainable. It's sustainable only to the extent to which you have capacity to borrow or alternatively to generate additional revenue. So it's really a question of how you redeploy your expenditure. And if you're going to redeploy it in construction, then by definition you have to take it away from something else. The answer is what? And realistically, I don't see those areas being cut because they are politically sensitive areas. And so far, this government has identified itself as being populist, as distinct from doing the right things, even if they do the right things in small doses. So yes, I can see some expenditure on construction. I don't see it being sustainable. I don't see it being sustainable in the long run. The points that you make, for example, with regard to redeployment, it's a long period of time and a long period of development. The point is that we have started. UTT needs to be developed. The direction of UTT needs to be concretized. And you can't be cutting programs willy-nilly here and there and restart them at some other time as they want. So, you know, if that's what you want to do, then you have to have a much more sustained effort.
We just have about a minute till we wrap. Your closing comments, Trinidad and Tobago. How would you rate the budget? What is the key element of the budget that you're hoping to see to label it a pass?
The key element will be the energy sector in terms of how we treat with the difficulties which are clearly facing us. There's a production difficulty, a substantial production difficulty, and our key revenue generator is energy. Second point, in terms of diversification, we have to move away from talk to action. And the third point is in terms of dealing with the areas of, if you want, subsidies and transfers. And how and giving us a formula by which we're going to reduce them relatively and absolutely. I think those are the key areas. And if we don't treat with those three areas, we are not going to deal with the future.
If we don't address those three areas, we're not going to be looking at a better future. Well, coming up after the 7 o'clock newscast, the Minister of Planning and Sustainable Development, Dr. Botiwari, will he have a response to some of the questions raised by Mr. Browne? Stay with us.
Now, if you want to talk about growth goals, Brighton was a growth.